Welcome to Readara. Today we are talking with authors of the book that is fascinating and everyone should consider reading it, BRICS or Bust, Escaping the Middle Income Trap. Today we have with us authors of the book, BRICS or Bust. And we have Hartmut Eisenhans, professor of University of Leipzig, and Salvatore Babones, professor of University of Sydney. Welcome to Readara.
Thanks for having us on the program.
Thanks.
Tell us what led you to write the book and what is the central theme of the book?
Well, I think, basically, both of us are asking the question how the world system develops, and the middle income countries, the BRICS are an important part of it. And then we have found out, in some conferences that we have something in common, and that's why we decided to look at it. And we have also, I think, an overall converging view about the world. We are considering that capitalism works best if labor is somewhere empowered.
And I think the BRICS are emblematic for the entire middle income tier of the global economy. There's nothing we say about the BRICS that would not also apply to other middle income countries like Mexico or Malaysia. But the BRICS really crystallize these ideas in 5 cases that people can really understand.
Mm-hmm. And those 5 BRIC countries, just to give a little context to the listeners, the B stands for Brazil, R for Russia, I for India, C for China, and S for South America.
South Africa.
South Africa. I'm sorry, South Africa. And these were very fast-growing nations in the early 2000s, and then before that, there were Asian tigers and other Southeastern Asian countries that were also growing rapidly. But you said, I don't want to take away your time, but you were saying there are 5 cases. So if you want to go and expand on that.
Well, the BRICS acronym, BRIC, without South Africa, was coined by the investment analyst Jim O'Neill. He referred to these countries as the 4, big emerging markets economies that had the chance to reshape the global economy. South Africa was later included, both because it nicely rounded out the acronym, made BRICS with a capital S at the end, but also because China insisted on including South Africa in the annual BRICS summits. And I think China did that mostly for political reasons. It wanted to have an additional BRIC on the African continent. And so the BRICS, B-R-I-C little s, became the BRICS, B-R-I-C capital S, with the inclusion of South Africa.
And tell us how these countries have been developing. Each one has its own strength. Each one has its own place in the global marketplace. And in many ways, their rise and potential stagnation in the future may parallel what happened in Japan, as you were explaining in the book early on.
I think they have one thing in common, at least those who succeed, China, India, better than Russia or Brazil. They are specializing on manufactured products, manufactured exports, and they make these exports cost competitive by a low exchange rate, lower than purchasing parity, and they succeed by creating relatively large number of jobs, and this leads to the development of an internal market. It additionally adds to the possibilities of growth. And our basic argument is they have to continue this process by giving more possibilities to labor, because the cost of labor in international terms depends only on the exchange rate and not on the real wage. The real wage only decides about the internal distribution, and basically, despite these countries being highly unequal, they succeed to the extent that they are able to develop their internal market of low-income people.
Yeah, the competitive exchange rate is especially important because within a country, poor people don't really care much about the exchange rate because poor people buy very few things that are imported or produced overseas. But for rich people, having a strong currency is very desirable because it allows them to travel, it allows them to buy international luxuries. And here's where Brazil and Russia have had their economies stalling for a very long time because both the Brazilian and Russian currencies have historically been overvalued. Thus, we see lots of Brazilian and Russian rich people traveling and investing in the US and UK and Europe, but we see very few benefits and very low, very high levels of unemployment in Brazil and Russia. India and especially China, by contrast, have historically had very competitive exchange rates. As a result, historically, they grew rapidly and increased welfare for their ordinary people living inside the country, who mainly consume products that are produced inside the country. And this has only started to change really since 2008. Since 2008, China's exchange rate has risen to the point where Chinese investors are now investing overseas, and Chinese people are now buying international luxuries and traveling overseas. And I think it's no coincidence that China's growth is now starting to slow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And as you explained in one of the chapters, that mass demand is the basis of all growth in these countries. And the earlier basic premise, as you were mentioning earlier, is to create a massive job at the mass level. So that gives them the purchasing power, which creates the demand locally, and that will allow them to migrate from a low income to a little bit higher or middle income economies.
Yes, I mean, I think
that's the basic argument, yeah. That's the basic argument. And there we are in the position to mainstream thinking. Mainstream thinking also in these countries tries to tell people, that you have to have a very low real income. And we are arguing you have to have a low real international cost of labor, which is not totally, but very much divorced from the local real wage, depending on whether you are able to produce the goods for poor people locally or not.
And I think a good way to think of this is anyone who's ever traveled in a country in a successful Asian country like Korea or Taiwan or Singapore, everybody knows when you travel in these countries, if you go to an international shopping mall, of course, you pay just as much as you would pay in California or London or any other developed market. But if you go to the local hawker center or the local night market, you can buy all the food and small household products you want at an incredibly cheap level. And the reality is that most local people don't shop at international shopping malls. Most local people are shopping in those night markets and in those hawker centers where they have an extremely low cost of living. This means that even though wages in these countries may appear to be low by international standards, living standards in those countries are actually quite high.
What are the challenges that these countries face if we want to go back to, let's say, early 80s, and we can take a case by case, maybe we can start first with China, where China was in the 50s, 60s, and then it has almost 3 years or 3 decades of growth, and what was driving that growth, and now where China stands.
Well, China started out its period of rapid growth as a very poor country in the 1970s. It had a very poorly planned economy that was dominated by state-owned industry and in which allocation was extremely inefficient. As China liberalized, of course, the economy became more efficient and the economy grew. But I think what's crucial for understanding why China grew so fast is to understand that China integrated into the global market in very selective ways. It kept its exchange rate very low. It continuously promoted wage growth in local currency terms, so that in China, wage growth throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s was consistent, was faster, was very fast, faster than overall rates of economic growth. And as a result, several 100 million people were moved out of poverty in China. That's a very different model from what we've seen with Russia's transition from a planned economy. Russia had a relatively efficient planned economy, as planned economies go. But when Russia liberalized, it set its exchange rate very high. It privatized its companies to people who making them instantly wealthy, concentrated wealth in a few people's hands. And real living standards for ordinary Russians have been stable or declining over the last 20 years. And I think that's the big contrast. Joining the larger global market doesn't mean the same thing for all countries. It depends on the ways in which they join. And I think China joined the global market in an intelligent way, and Russia joined the global market in a way that really benefited oligarchs more than it benefited ordinary people.
China set the terms of its trade and joined the world trade much later when it thought that China was ready to join the world trade also. But if you were to go back to China's case and explain why Chinese government decided to do it the way you explained it did, and also why China was able to increase the wages in the local terms that other countries such as Russia were not.
I think there were two things for the two successful cases, India and China. That was that both countries were so poor that the mass of consumption of the poor people was food, and they both succeeded in the Green Revolution. In Russia, and to some extent also in Brazil, you had already richer people, and you had very important incomes from raw materials, which allowed you to have a very high exchange rate. Neither India nor China have had such well-earning raw materials, and therefore they had to start at a relatively low level of the international cost of their labor.
There are also good reasons or important reasons why China pursued better policies than Russia. In the 1980s, China spent a decade in a program of study in which they invited economists and planners and managers from the US primarily and also from Europe to come make presentations to Chinese economists and planners. And what's crucial is they invited a plurality of economists. They didn't just take the leading economist from Chicago Business School or from the IMF. They also wanted to hear from radical economists. They wanted to hear from Marxist economists. They wanted to hear from political economists, Keynesian economists. They wanted to get a plurality of views from which they could then pick and choose what they thought was the best solution for their country. This is very different from Russia, where simply there was a very top-down implementation of marketization in Russia, inspired by a very neoliberal American Harvard Chicago mindset. Russia did not take the time to digest a plurality of economic views. They simply invited a few economists, took their word for it, and implemented drastic reform overnight.
So in many ways, Russia pursued, for right or wrong reasons, a shock therapy or Big Bang therapy driven by some major events, whereas China took a thoughtful, careful experimentation and planning.
I think that's broadly speaking, that's true. China was very careful in its program of economic liberalization. It liberalized small centers first. It experimented. South China, Guangdong province around Guangzhou, was opened to Hong Kong capital. So there was a lot of small capitalist investment in Guangdong province. But in the Yangtze River Delta around Shanghai and Suzhou, there was a different kind of very large-scale investment by Western firms and Japanese firms that dominated there. Meanwhile, in other provinces in China, like Fujian province and Anhui province, there were local liberalization where local people were encouraged to become entrepreneurs. So there were multiple models in multiple areas of China where they experimented with different ways of opening to the global market. That resulted in a much careful, paced approach that I think was much more effective than Russia's rapid liberalization after 1991.
In many ways, in your understanding and research, what has been your findings that were Chinese people were ready to work hard and sacrifice for the next generations. And in some ways, you couldn't say that for Russians because they probably were relatively or perceived as lazy, or certain kind of work they just wouldn't do because it's just beneath them. Was there any of that cultural nuances were in place, or how did people expect in China?
We did not find any such
No,
thing of really cultural differences. I think also if you take other cases, it's all the same. Yeah. Supposedly, if you make people earn from their income, and if you make entrepreneurs make some profit, then you have this mobilization. And what we are finding out is all depends on the competitiveness in relation to international business, which sells products in these countries, and where these enterprises want to sell products on the world market. If that works, then you have hardworking people and you have a relatively rapid increase of employment.
And I think it's wrong to think that there's anywhere in the world where people don't want to work hard or people don't want to provide for their children. Given the opportunity that if they work hard, they will better their lives and improve lives for their children, people anywhere will work hard. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that 40 or 50 years ago, the cultural stereotype about China was that Chinese people are lazy and won't put in effort because they believe that if they work hard, the government will simply take their profit or take their surplus. And so if we were talking 50 years ago, you would have asked the exact opposite question. You would have asked, is China held back by its lazy people who don't want to work hard or plan for the future? That was the narrative 50 or 100 years ago. That narrative's changed completely, not because Chinese people have changed, but because the environment in which they live has changed.
And also the incentives they think they have now, that getting rich is glorious, and that's why probably they pursued as well.
Well, getting rich is nice anywhere, but the point is that in China today, if you work hard, you can advance yourself, your family, and your children. That was not true in China 40 or 50 years ago. It's no coincidence that as a result, people work harder today than they worked 40 or 50 years ago. Given the opportunities, people will work hard anywhere in the world. Africans are not lazy. Indians are not lazy. They're poor because they have less beneficial environments in which to work.
Very well said. In the early on in the book, in the first chapter, you have trajectories, economic, political, and social. Maybe you want to summarize for how, especially these three countries, Brazil, Russia, China, and India, four countries, how those trajectories were and where the similarities and dissimilarities were, other than you earlier very well pointed out that Brazil and Russia had a major advantage of selling commodities to the world market, and they had a little bit higher exchange rate than they should have had. But are there other things that Russia had to fight in the breakup of Soviet Union? China always has to fight, but we never know how hard it is for them to put the vast territory of the country together. Are there things that you discovered that people may not have understood socially or politically or economically?
To me, the fascinating thing is not the trajectories, it's the destinations. It's the fact that these five very different countries coming from very different backgrounds, Brazil with a military dictatorship in the past, and Russia with its, global military empire, India with its state-centered economy that was very low productivity, China with its badly functioning central planning, South Africa with its racism and apartheid. These very different countries are all converging on the same globalized kind of position in the world. Globalization has made them all very similar. And that similar outcome is middle income by global standards, high levels of inequality, terrible levels of air and water and environmental pollution, and relatively productive economies that are not advancing to the next stage, that are not developing beyond middle income. For China, that means its growth is now slowing. For India, it means that there's still a lot of space to grow before its growth stalls. India is not yet at the same income level. For Russia and Brazil, it means long-term stagnation. So even though these countries are coming from different places, they're all ending up trapped at that level of GDP per capita of around $10,000 or $12,000 per year.
Historically, when you enter the middle income trap, and if you can also explain what that trap is and how other countries have faced and dealt with it, and as you say, they're all converging to the middle income, and now in so-called trap, is the trap short, long, or that's where they'll end and stagnate and never go? Explain to us why this middle income trap is very important and how each of these countries can deal with it to get out of it.
Well, I think we have two things there. If you want to catch up, you have to have some industrial policy to concentrate on modern technology. And second, you have to use your internal market. And use your internal market means that to produce, to create an incentive to develop new technologies, because the entrepreneur knows that he will sell in large quantities. Technology means always first sunk costs, important sunk costs, and you have to give an assurance to the entrepreneur that if he succeeds there, then he will be able to sell rapidly large quantities, which allow him to distribute the sunk costs on a large quantity of products. Therefore, our argument is these countries should increase their orientation to their internal mass markets. And our argument about this is that these countries emerge from this from this trajectory to middle income trap. They start from a power position where the poor have not power. The poor have the only power of the poor is that they are scarce as profitable workers. And this social structure does not change so fast that these poor people feel that they are the basis of growth. They have no conscience of this process. And the rich people think that growth, under the influence of all these institutions, which Salvatore has mentioned, the rich people think we are growing because we are rich. And this leads to a certain stall of the process.
And I think it's really fascinating that the Chinese government's economists actually recognize this problem. So for the last 2 years, official government policy in China has been to reorient the Chinese economy away from high levels of fixed asset investment and towards a mass consumption economy. But even though they have that rhetorical acceptance, that they realize they have to move towards an economy based on mass consumption, they're unwilling to implement the policies that would bring that about. And they're unwilling to implement those policies because now that China is a middle-income country, it has a group of very wealthy people who much prefer policies that benefit the wealthy. And when you say mass consumption, when we say mass consumption, that doesn't mean consumption by the wealthy. Wealthy people, even if they consume very visibly, you might think that it's disgusting how much wealthy people consume. The real fact is that most of the money wealthy people have stays in their pockets. It stays in the bank. It stays in their investments. If you give a poor person $1, the poor person spends 99 cents because the poor person has to eat. The poor person has to have clothing. If you give a rich person $1, 90 cents of that dollar goes in the bank. Right? So mass consumption means a shift towards consumption by poor and middle-income people, not the consumption of the very wealthy.
Well, I would add one thing. If you want to have productivity increase, one source of productivity increase is to increase the production in large production batches. And rich people will buy things which distinguishes. So should not have too many people should have not a rich person's car. poor people were only interested in cheap things. So the entrepreneur who are producing for poor people will develop all sorts of technologies which are reducing the cost. And when he does this, he will realize, as I have reduced the cost, say, for the car, I will be able also to reduce the cost for the airplane. That was the historical process, because before the people was thinking about the possibility of the car, they were certainly not thinking of the possibility of the airplane.
And I think you can put this in very practical terms. If you ask your listeners to imagine the difference between making bags, handbags for ordinary people, cheap handbags that millions of people will buy, versus making luxury handbags for the ultra wealthy. The production processes for making cheap handbags are incredibly efficient. They're pushing to save 1 penny on the way the leather is stitched. Like, every effort goes into making that bag in a slightly more efficient way. But if you're talking about high-end handbags that you find in airport luxury stores, no one is really working to make that an incredibly efficient process. They're happy to have a lot of fat in the process, because what does it matter? If you're selling a bag for $10,000, does it really matter if you save a penny on stitching?
I would add for your listeners an American case. The Europeans were developing the large clocks, and they were with carved wood. Americans in the 19th century were developing also large clocks, but because it was an egalitarian society, they were painting only the clock house and not carving, and that made it cheap.
Very good points. And we do say that also more and more use of plastic and other materials in their automobiles just to make the cars more affordable.
Yes.
Compared to the European and American cars. And then it goes to a lot of luxury products, jewelry, and many other things as well. We have costume jewelry market, whereas in Europe, you have real jewelry market. Coming back to China, which has been the most successful among BRICS nations, China invested, or why Chinese companies were able to increase the productivity, because the increase in productivity is the real thing that drives everything else. I think it's the main driver of everything first. Why China was successful in increasing its productivity? Was it because they were copying the engineering from others, or was it they were sincerely innovating, or was it they were sincerely going after and finding ways to make it cheaper just because their American customers demanded it?
China is very closely integrated in production networks that span the entire Pacific Ocean. China learned how to make cars from Japanese and Korean automakers. China learned how to make mobile phones from American mobile phone producers. China learned how to make consumer electronics from Taiwanese companies. Even before that, China learned how to make shirts and garments from Hong Kong garment makers. And China has consistently clawed its way up these chains because once you're making shirts, you can make pants. Once you're making shirts and pants, you can make suits. And once you're making suits, you can start to make ballistic fabrics for specialty markets, right? And the same is true for cars, same is true for electronics. It's learning by doing. And this is an opportunity China has that I think India has struggled with because India is recapitulating China's growth trajectory. It's catching up, but India is catching up much more slowly. And I think part of the reason is that India is not integrated into these global networks where it can learn by doing. Instead, India is developing entirely new industries like business process outsourcing. And they are learning in India, but it's much more difficult to learn when you have to invent the wheel for yourself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, if we take that argument that you put forward, which is extremely good argument, China benefited by interacting with the rest of the world. I mean, it's fascinating. What you just said was such a great insight that most people, most prime ministers of the world should be listening to.
They are not listening, not because they cannot listen. I think most of them represent people who do not want to listen.
There's a strong political incentive for countries not to listen when rich people in those countries prefer policies that benefit rich people.
Correct. Correct. And we see that in America too for the last several years as well, here as well right now. Continuing that argument that you were explaining very well, that China interacted and as a process learned by doing it, and largely because their labor was cheap, and that was an attraction for the Hong Kong company to go to mainland, and that was an attraction for the American company to go to China and so on. But now the Chinese wages are rising and not as competitive in the real terms in the international market, as you said earlier. Many of these factories are moving away from China. And if that's the case, where their learning by doing will stop or slow down, and that may drive their future growth slower and slower. Does that make sense? Is it realistic? Is it true?
I think that is a danger because if other countries enter, they will do the same thing, and China will have difficulties to keep its exchange rate low, because if you have high levels of employment, then if you keep your exchange rate low, it does not work so well. I think, all these countries will therefore discover at one point or else, that they should, have some sort of international cooperation to make the solution feasible.
But remember that if China were to have a lower exchange rate, wages could still rise in China, even without the wages rising in international terms. And that's really the key. I mean, China famously has the world's largest foreign currency reserves, $3 trillion of foreign currency reserves. I think you should ask yourself, how did they get $3 trillion of foreign currency reserves? And the answer is that they were continually selling yuan and buying foreign currency over the last 30 years in order to keep the value of the yuan low. Now, that process is reversed. Now, China's foreign currency reserves are declining, not increasing. China's currency is now appreciating against other global currencies. And that's part of a conscious policy for the last 2 years of the Chinese government, has been to make the yuan a more strong, sound money currency in preparation for the yuan entering into the IMF special drawing rights basket and as part of the program of internationalizing the yuan. Well, internationalizing the yuan sounds great if you are a liberal economist at the IMF who believes that all currencies should be convertible and all investment should favor international investors. But that may not be a great strategy for ordinary Chinese workers or for growth in China. I think it's very symptomatic that China's currency reserves, which were increasing consistently for 30 years, are now declining. And capital flight is now the big problem in China.
Here is a layman's question that you could probably clarify. When countries are rapidly growing or rapidly trying to expand, they keep the currency low, thereby they can export more. And when you do that, generally inflation becomes very high because you also have to import something to make something to export. Now, why China was able to do that without having the inflation that you see in Brazil or in India or in many parts of the world, which is substantially higher, over 6 to 10% in some cases, whereas China has very low inflation despite having to keep selling yuan at a relatively cheaper prices.
I don't think that the inflation is directly linked to the exchange rate, provided if your local share in production is continually growing. That's what the Chinese did, and they could do it because they had these cheap local costs, cheap international costs, because they very early learned not only to make products but also to make technology. If you look into the career of Chinese high-tech enterprises, they start by supplying mass consumption products for the local market, and they learn more complicated technologies, and they go then to the international market. And no other country is worked so well as in China.
And I think it's important to remember that before 2008, China imported very little from the rest of the world. Almost all of China's imports were simply components of products that were then exported again. Well, when you import computer chips in order to export a computer, the exchange rate is irrelevant. If the exchange rate is low, that means you have to purchase the chips at a very high price, but then when you sell the computer, you sell it at a very high price. It is irrelevant to the production process what the exchange rate is. Now, today, that's differing. Today, China is becoming a major importer of luxury goods. And as a result, in China today, a low exchange rate would mean inflation. But it would mean inflation for the rich and middle class in China, not inflation for poor people. I mean, I think we make a mistake when we think the whole country has a single inflation rate. It doesn't, especially in countries like China or even its competitors in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea. They have very different kinds of markets for the international elite and for local people. And that's very different from the US. I mean, in the United States, it doesn't matter if you go to a shopping mall for rich people or you go to a shopping mall for poor people. All the stores have the same prices for the same goods. But in Asia, there are these very different markets that are almost different worlds. Poor people shop in a completely different world from the world of international shopping malls. And as a result, poor people have a different price structure than rich people.
Yeah, for the manufactured goods markets that are sold primarily in the shopping malls, the U.S. is obviously another developed nation. It's a far equal society, but when it comes to the other developing society, these societies are not equal because their purchasing powers are different as well. And there are a lot of strengths and differences within each of the society, as you pointed out. But why is that China able to, as you explained, that it was not much of an import, it was all export, which was primarily value add that was coming from the labor add component export, whereas Vietnam is doing the same thing, but Vietnam is having tremendous inflation for the last 10 years, even though the exports are growing and they are gaining more and more market share away from China and in apparels and many other industries, but the inflation is widespread. And so is in other countries that are in that same trajectory as well.
China also suffered severe inflation in the 1980s in its early stages of growth. Before the central bank better learned how to manage the money supply and learned how to manage the currency. And I think Vietnam is going through that kind of learning process. But Vietnam, at a more fundamental level, I think is following the same trajectory as China. And if I had to pick a winner in Southeast Asia for the next 20 or 30 years, my money would be on Vietnam.
No, perfect. It makes a lot of sense. The reason I bring up the inflation is that inflation, as you mentioned, there is inflation and it is different for different groups of people within the country, because the food price inflation in India has been a gigantic hurdle for the government. And that's what generally leads to election, that leads to change of power or change of government, primarily driven by what happens in the food prices. Even after 30 years, monsoon is still important in India simply because of the agricultural production and prices determine what happens in the next election. But that is not the case in China, because China has moved beyond that, and probably is the case also in Russia too.
I think the difference between China and India is exactly the agricultural sector. All these countries have as an essential condition the ability to increase rapidly food production, because if the poor people get more money, they spend for a lot of time a constant share of this money on food, and it's about 40 to 50%. I think in the Indian case, the agricultural sector did not grow so fast as in China. And there is a basic thing to this. In China, they had a relatively egalitarian distribution of land, and you had farmers who were, if they had no other possibility to get a better paid job, all these farmers tried to increase production. And even if they had to work overtime, etc., because they got something more. In India, you have not such an egalitarian distribution of land. You have middle peasants would increase somewhat production. But if the effort they have to provide is so important that they have to hire additional workers, then they will not increase as a family farm the production. Because in the family farm, that's something we know for the last 100 years, also in all countries. Poor family farmers have a sort of reserve of labor which they use to put Salvatore's argument, if they have more children, that one can see that in the life cycle of a poor farmer, he works more than when the children are small than later, And for this, you have to have the farmer as an owner, because the farmer has to work, say, after 6 o'clock, still 2 hours. If, however, these 2 hours are expensive because you have to hire a worker, then we will not provide this employment, and they will produce less. And it will appear as to be more profitable because the cost of this additional work in labor time is very high. And so I think this structural fact of the Chinese economy is important in order to compare it to India.
And we have extra evidence on this from Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Most people don't realize that in the 1950s, all three of those countries had major, large-scale land redistribution from a small number of rich landlords to broad peasant ownership of their own land. And we forget, because we focus in those countries on their high-tech industries, on semiconductors or on computers and automobiles. But in reality, in the 1950s, all three of them started with heavily agricultural societies where the ordinary farmers gained an enormous increase in income in the 1950s. And as a result, the children of those ordinary farmers were able to go to school, they were able to build better houses, they were able to go to work in the manufacturing economy, all because of that rural land reform that occurred in the 1950s. What's interesting is that in all three countries, it was for different reasons. In Japan, the land reform was because the U.S. Occupation Administration tried to implement a U.S.-style system of independent family farmers, because they thought family farmers were the foundation of American democracy. They wanted democracy in Japan, so they wanted to break up the landlord system and have family farmers in Japan. In Taiwan, land reform occurred because the new Kuomintang, the KMT administration of Chiang Kai-shek, went to Taiwan and found that all the land was in the hands of Japanese sympathizers who had controlled the land under Japanese colonialism. So it took the land away from the Japanese sympathizers and gave it to their demobilized soldiers. In Korea, there was land reform again because the local elite were Japanese landlords. And of course, the Japanese landlords had to leave when Japan lost World War II and South Korea became independent. So that land went from the possession of Japanese landlords into the possession of their former Korean tenants. Different reasons, but all three cases had a massive redistribution of land from rich landlords to poor peasants around the same time in the post-war period.
Yeah, and the Chinese case is just similar. They have redistributed. They did not earn the effects because they were state regulating the economy, and when then they stopped state regulation of these family farms, then it worked.
Yeah, China got rid of the landlords in the 1950s also, but from 1950 to 1980, you could think of the state as the great landlord of China. Of course, after 1980, China redistributed land to the peasants who worked the land as individual owners of the land. And as a result, those peasant owners themselves became better off. They were able to invest. They were able to put more effort into their land. They earned more income. They sent their kids to school, and they flourished.
In many ways, India and Brazil are on the same path, at the same juncture, in a little bit different milestones on the agricultural reform. In your experience, what India should do for the land reform, knowing the context of India and Brazil, and in Brazil as well?
And South Africa, you could put in the same club with India and Brazil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you think India should do? What do you think Brazil and South Africa should do? Because how can they do the land reform? Because there is a different context in each of the countries. They just simply give away the land to the farmers, so those who farm, they can have it. But then where would they get capital to put the equipment and improve the productivity and irrigation and so on?
Well, I think India has industries for many aspects of making agriculture more productive. I think, if you are able to build large tractors, you can also make smaller ones. I think that's not the side of also Brazil. I think in the 1950s, relatively radical land reform was possible because the elite still had very much fear of a communist threat. That's true for Taiwan, that's true for Korea. That's naturally also to some extent true for Japan because you have a very strong extreme left at the first years of the American occupation. I don't think that it's very realistic to think today that a country like Brazil is able to dispossess the landowners without important indemnities, etc. And I think, in India, the middle peasants are so important for the political power structure that you cannot do this. But I think, there's an interesting point which you mentioned largely in the book. You can today, with the administrative capacity of today, have a sort of substitute, and that is payments to the subsidies to the poor. I think, the case of the Brazilian Bolsa Familiar, that is a sort of income of poor families, provided that they send children to school and to the doctor, and some employment programs in India show that this is not very costly in terms of money compared to what you would get from the world market in addition. It's the same case still, I think it would be realistic to encourage these things because I think the political conflict may be very dangerous for a growth process if you would now mobilize like you did in the 1950s. Today, the elites in these countries would not accept to say, we have to make concessions because otherwise there is communism. They will say, communism has failed, So what do you say, So I think, we have to have a more accommodative, more reformist approach for these countries. And if the international institutions would strongly intervene for these things, that would also be a convincing point for the local elites because they are very much believing what is said on the world market.
Yeah, the main barriers to land reform are not technical, they're political. Technically, land reform can easily be accomplished, for example, through the taxation system. You can implement a nationwide land tax that has a exemption for small holdings so that the first 5 acres of land are untaxed, but any land in excess of that is taxed. As a result, large landowners have a strong incentive to sell land to poor peasants and break up large holdings. And the tax system is just one way that land reform can be accomplished. Another way is through outright government purchase of land. But as Hartmut said, the point is not land reform as such. The point is raising the incomes of the rural poor. Now, land reform is an easy, direct way to do that. But indirect mechanisms are also possible. Ultimately, however, they depend on the fiscal capacity of the state, where you have enormous inequalities. The state has to do one of two things. Either it has to tax the wealthy and redistribute that in spending or in subsidies to the poor and middle class, or the government has to create a regulatory environment that prevents the rise of inequality in the first place. So you can think of one as an active way to reduce inequality, take from the rich and give to the poor. The other is a passive way to reduce inequality by having a regulatory structure that favors low and middle income people. So I can give you an example of each. Tax and spend, you can see the Brazilian Bolsa Familia. Tax the population using a progressive income tax, but give money to poor families to subsidize their living standards. But an example of a regulatory approach would be to make it very easy for people to form unions and cooperative associations and to provide legal support for those unions and cooperative organizations so that poor landowners and poor workers could more easily band together to demand greater pay and benefits for themselves. Right? So either mechanism can work. The United States used to have a very strong tradition of government support for cooperatives and for unions. So both farmers who banded together, many small farmers in a sellers cooperative, or workers who banded together, many poor workers in a union, could have more pricing power vis-a-vis, in the farmer's case, vis-a-vis the agricultural companies, and in the workers' case, vis-a-vis their employers. Now, that's not government redistribution, but that's government policy that favors self-help. Now, in the U.S., we've deregulated and we've made it much more difficult for people to form unions and cooperatives. And so inequality has increased in the United States. But both of these mechanisms are possible and doable. It takes the political will to do it. There's no economic barrier to either government redistribution or government tilting the playing field.
Fascinating. Moving on, the discussion in the interest of the time, considering where China is, there are two well understood facts, but where does your opinion kind of sit on it? One is Chinese government or Chinese state-owned enterprises rather have amassed a vast amount of debt. We don't know whether it could be repaid or not, even though it's in local terms, but that doesn't mean that it has to be forgiven. At some point, it probably will have to be paid to keep the soundness of the banking system. And the second thing is China's heavy focus on infrastructure, obviously over the years, has led to enormous growth and expansion in urbanization across the country and building highways and bridges and so on. But there are also, quote unquote, at least 100 ghost cities now that are completely or nearly inhabited. Does this mean that, yes, Japan also went through 2 decades of stagnation, but Japanese people still enjoy a living standard, but they have ceded or they have given up their rising military ambitions of the 70s and 80s has pretty much disappeared completely. Is China in similar situation, or how is it going to deal with the debt problem? How is it going to deal with the infrastructure it doesn't even need or it cannot even use?
China is much poorer than Japan, and I don't think that there's a problem that China is building too much infrastructure. In fact, if all China were doing were building infrastructure, I'd say that's actually a good thing. In a way, it's a form of consumption. It's government consumption, right? It's not consumption by individuals, but it's putting people to work. It's very Keynesian. It's very much putting money into ordinary people's hands. The problem in China is this rising debt level that you mentioned, and the problem with debt is not that China can't handle the debt. As you said, the debt's in local currency terms. China is not that articulated with the global financial system. The problem is that using increasing debt as a mechanism for government spending creates an exponential spiral. The debt has to increase. If it has to increase by double digits, right now it's increasing somewhere between 10 and 20% per year. No one knows the exact number, as you said. 10 or 20% per year of increasing debt when GDP is only growing, if you believe the government, 6.5%. If you don't believe the government, maybe 3%. Well, for 1 year, for 2 years, for 3 years, that results in simply higher and higher levels of debt. But at some point, no one knows at what point, but at some point, it's simply no longer possible to continue to increase debt levels. At some point, the banking system is operating on such a tiny margin that it simply gets riskier and riskier every year. So at some point, China has to rein in debt growth. And when China reins in debt growth, the Chinese economy will slow. Whether that's this year or next year, I don't know. Frankly, I'm surprised it's lasted so long. My own research has focused on Chinese fiscal capacity, that is government spending capacity. And I said that China's government spending capacity would run out in 2016. And I think I was right. What China has done is, instead of increasing government spending, it's simply directed state-owned banks to go further and further into higher and higher leverage. So China has shifted government spending onto the banking sector. And instead of the government spending, government-owned banks are spending on the government's behalf. How far that can go, honestly, I don't know. I'm not a banking economist. All I know is that it can't go forever. And when the day of reckoning comes, it doesn't mean that there will be a crash. What it means is that growth will slow when that day of reckoning comes. The crash can be avoided, but the slowdown can't be avoided.
Exactly. There won't be a bang, but slowly the air will leak out the bubble, and that's when the things get ugly for 10, 20 years of stagnation, like in Japan.
Well, there might be a bang. I don't know how well the Chinese government will manage this debt spiral. There could be a bang. There could be a slow hiss, as you said. But one way or another, you can't continually promote growth through ever increasing debt forever.
But I would add, if you have this model of ever increasing debt, then that is an expression that you are unable or unwilling to tax those people who are providing the money, which is rented out. Ultimately, I think that means that you have to consider whether you want to have monetary asset increases in the hands of the rich class without financing, with the risk of the rich class, additional investment. And that's a good case for taxation because the rich people in capitalism are supposed to become rich because they are investing the money.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the rates of income taxation in the BRICS countries are extraordinarily low. I mean, in the United States, I'm American, and we think of the United States as a low-tax country. And the top marginal tax rate in the U.S. is around 41%. Other countries in Europe, and Japan have even higher top tax rates. In China, virtually no income tax is collected at all. They do have an income tax, and it is progressive, but most of the people don't even pay income tax because they earn money outside of official channels. Pretty much only people who work for international firms or the government actually pay income tax in China. So, with low income tax rates that are not collected, I mean, all of the BRICS countries have serious problems with tax evasion, in addition to having low tax rates to begin with, mean that the government simply doesn't have the fiscal capacity to spend at an appropriate level. I mean, we're not advocating that BRICS countries have some, take from the rich and give to the poor Robin Hood level of taxation. We're just suggesting that they have a level that Americans have been used to for decades, or that Europeans have been used to for decades. We could debate whether the top marginal tax rate should be 40%, 60%, or 80%, but we can't debate whether it should be 10 or 40. It certainly has to come up to levels that predominate in developed countries. I mean, the way I put it is very simple. If you want to be rich, do as rich countries do. Don't do as rich countries say. Do as rich countries do. And our advice to the BRICS countries, if you want to put it in the most simple terms, is just run your economy in a way that's similar to the way Japan, the US, and Germany run their economies.
Very good points. If Chinese, and so is the case in India, only 3% of the people or less actually do fill out even the form or pay an income tax. If Chinese people are in the same situation as India is, what are the incomes of the Chinese government? Is it sales tax? Sales tax is generally prerogative of the regional or provincial government. So how does Chinese government make money?
Value-added tax is the main source of income, and the second source of income is profits from state-owned enterprises. So China's main sources of income are value-added tax and corporate income tax.
Corporate income tax, VAT, and the SEO's profits.
Yes. Well, SEO profits are taxed as corporate income tax. So their SEOs are allowed to keep their profits subject to a corporate income tax. But many private companies simply don't pay corporate income tax. So in effect, it becomes a tax on SEOs. SEOs and large firms pay corporate income tax. But what China lacks is a strong progressive income tax. It does have income taxes, but they're not widespread and they're not well enforced, and they have a relatively low top tax rate.
Okay, no, that's clear. It's fascinating.
I'll put that, if I can contrast that, the United States government, its single largest source of revenue is a progressive personal income tax. The IRS that we're all familiar with and that we all fear is the main source of income for the U.S. government. And that's simply not the case in any of the BRICS countries.
In the recent case, and I'm just drawing a pattern over the last 40, 50 years, and you can obviously explain more or contradict it. When the poor economies somehow hitch on to some large economies and provide a better or some kind of efficient services or products to them, they generally benefit, and that becomes the path to success. I mean, in obviously China, America, despite the political noises, that corporate nexus between the two countries has allowed China to escape the poverty or extreme poverty and move up at a much higher level. That also happened in many ways with the America latching on to the UK early on and then reversing it after several hundred years, several decades.
And you might add Mexico and NAFTA. NAFTA and North American integration has been a fantastic success story for the Mexican economy.
Right. And so is similarly, as I was just about to say, exactly. And with Poland and Germany, do you see similar pairing happening more and more at the production level or at the service level? And, India is benefiting from U.S. largely because of the service level industry connection between the two economies. Do you see similar pairs coming up in the next 10, 20 years that could benefit other emerging Polands?
I think the problem is that China and India are practically 2/3 of the poor countries. So I think the rest of the poor countries is just one point. And it's absolutely clear that there are two motors to this from the developed world, that the United States and that the European Union. And the problem is, as they go into crisis, those forces tend to prevail, who think that giving more access to the poor countries to their markets would endanger their jobs. And there, we have not dealt with this in the book but the basic argument is, provided that the rich countries accept to enlarge their internal markets and have a more favorable policy in relation to labor, they can absorb these additional exports. If we take the German case, Germany loses more jobs by not increasing mass incomes in line with productivity than by additional imports from those countries. And that's a whole theoretical struggle. That's what Salvatore says. We have a dominant economic science which is irrealistic, but which is capable of having support because it serves rich people. And the rich people may hear that this can, often very nonsensical things can be taught in universities on their tax power. We argue a little bit different, and therefore we are also marginal to this in the international discussion.
And something we don't really develop in the book, but I think will really resonate with people, is that China is very different from the other BRICS countries because China is closely integrated into these global value chains. And as a result, China has a ladder to climb. It may not climb it. For political reasons, it's choosing policies that will keep it lower down the ladder, but it could climb the ladder. Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, the unfortunate acronym BRICS, are in a way cut off from the global economy, which means the models for them are a little different. And I think a good model for these other countries, for countries that are not part of these integrated global value chains, might be a country like Australia. Now, I'm American, but I teach at the University of Sydney in Australia. Australia is completely disintegrated, separated from global value chains. If you look at Australia's major exports, there are things like iron and coal and educational services, but Australia is not part of global manufacturing value chains. Yet Australia is still very rich. And Australia is rich because Australia has developed internally in the ways that Hartmut talks about and that the later chapters of the book really focus on, that it's developed high levels of mass consumption among poor and working people in Australia itself. Minimum wages are incredibly high in Australia. There's universal social services, universal health care, and wages are set at a very high minimum by a national wages council that keeps wages so high that even a fast food worker earns something around 23 Australian dollars or, around 16 or 17 or 18 US dollars an hour. And I tell Americans this, that, fast food workers, in America, we have the Fight for 15 campaign to get fast food wages up to $15 an hour. And I tell them in Australia, fast food wages are higher than that. And we still have McDonald's and Burger King in Australia. It's not a problem. So I think that when countries like India and Brazil look to a model that they could follow, rather than looking at Japan or South Korea, I think Australia makes much more sense. Australia doesn't produce any famous name brand global industrial products. Yet it's a high productivity, high wealth, high standard of living economy.
Very well said. And so it probably could be said about Canada too.
I would add to this one point for your listeners. Most people of the other side say you need enormous amounts of capital to develop. Therefore, you need rich. Historically, for the last 150 years, the amount of capital has only increased because the price of the workers who produce the investment goods went up because they got higher real wages. If you take the relation between net national product and the stock of capital used in the United States or in Germany, this does not increase. So to some extent, one can say to your listeners, capitalism does not consist of capital accumulation. That's only leftist markets who think this, or bankers. The reality is capitalism saves on capital because capitalists have to increase productivity from year to year. And that's like this, And in Germany, actually, in German industry, the amount of capital necessary for increasing production decreases in the last 20 years by 50%.
Yeah, I think Hartmut and I are in a minority of two, because Hartmut is absolutely right that, strangely, both people on the far left and people on the far right give too much credit to rich people. People on the far right think rich people are fantastic, and people on the far left think capitalism is awful because it generates rich people. But both of us view rich people as a barrier to capitalism, not as a integral part of capitalism. It's rich people who tend to smother real competition and real capitalism in the world.
Because they have the vested interest to preserve the capital.
They have a vested interest in a neo-feudal world where rich people are rewarded simply for being rich. And that's not capitalism.
Right, exactly. Fascinating discussion. I can go on and take your time away for another 10 hours if I had the liberty, but I would not do that. Why? Two questions related to the book. Why do you have the title BRICS or Bust, or why not say BRICS Beyond Middle Income Trap? And second, why currencies are so important that all the currencies are on the cover and not, as you probably explained to me, the competitive exchange rates are very important for the growth of these economies. But isn't the productivity increase and global integration and those are even bigger factors? Just curious, why these two things on the book cover?
So let me give you the facile answer, and I'll let Hartmut give you the deeper answer. And the simple answer is that BRICS or Bust is the title of the book because for the last 15 years, we've heard endlessly how the BRICS are going to take over the world. And in our view, the BRICS are actually a bust. The BRICS are not going to take over the world because they're stuck in a middle income trap, a self-perpetuated middle income trap. The money's in the cover because Stanford University Press thought that was a clever cover design. But we do talk a lot about exchange rates, and Hartmut is the expert here, so I'll let him answer that question.
I think for your listeners, the basic point is money. You cannot accumulate money in capitalism. You can accumulate debts. There are no savings without debts. Whereas most people think, the money can be touched. I am from a country where the money has lost its value for 2 periods, and people realized that when the money had lost the value, the economy went very well up afterwards. After 1408, we had not money. We had approximately today's 3 hours work as a money in pocket for 1 month. Yeah? But the thing worked because the new money regulated well the economy. And therefore, money is a regulation. It's very important. It's like the steering wheel of your car. But you never would put the steering wheel on your wheels outside. You would also have other wheels. So I think money is important for regulation, but it's not a value storing thing if there are not people who are indebted. I tell my students on the character of nature, the first lesson, I asked them, if everybody gets 1 million, what will happen, yeah? And then they were all to travel all over the world. And then I am asking them, and who will solve the coffee? And then they realize that only labor is value and money is regulating things. So the first. Now, in international terms, the question is, do I get full employment at what international price of my money? Yeah? And that is what we are describing. Yeah? That is, we are arguing, yeah, you have to have an exact exchange rate, yeah? And you have to have rather a lower exchange rate than a higher one. And that has nothing to do whether you are an underdeveloped country. The American vision of West Germany in the 1950s was very close to the American vision of Mr. Trump's vision of what happens with China. Yeah? And some of your older listeners will remember the slogan on the Volkswagen car, unsafe at any speed. Yeah? It's the same thing as you are talking about Chinese products. So I think, yeah, all these countries have met their way by lowering their exchange rate. And the point is, you can do this provided that you are producing your local wage goods locally. And at the level of at the national level, differences in remunerations of labor are moved by are solved by migration. Yeah? In America, in the 1930s, people went south, etc. At the international level, that is done by exchange rate adjustment. The best case for your listeners is the European Union is no nation because it has never fixed the equal wages in different regions, and it has maintained until the euro the possibility of devaluation. And what we are now discussing is, if we have this possibility, then if we have no more the possibility of devaluation, then we have to do something else for equalizing, as we cannot move all through the migration. So I think a nation has a uniform currency, and internationally one has different currencies.
I think something that makes the money myth very clear is when you think, for you or me, having an extra dollar is valuable. It makes me richer. But for a country, having more money in total is not a sign of wealth. And I'll give you the perfect example. China has $3 trillion in foreign currency reserves. The United States has virtually no foreign currency reserves. Which country is richer? Well, clearly the United States is incredibly richer than China. China holds foreign currency reserves as a policy tool, not because having money in the central bank makes China richer.
2 questions, and these are true last questions. I don't pull more from you. Number one, just to continue on that argument, if you ask me who is richer, American government is, quote unquote, in every economic term, is bankrupt because there's no way it is going to be ever able to repay its debt of 16, 17 trillion that we have. Whereas China cannot afford to be bankrupt simply because nobody else will then hold their currency, because American dollar is a reserve currency, at least for now. But do you see that there was a time that Japan could have become the motor, the third motor in pulling other countries out of this poverty, and China could become one, but still after 15, 17 and 30, 40 years for Japan, still, we're stuck with the twin motor, U.S. and Western Europe. There is no third or fourth motor rising.
Only 15 years ago, in 2002, I remember when Alan Greenspan went before a Senate committee and said that the United States had to have a big tax cut because very soon the U.S. national debt would be paid off And if U.S. national debt were paid off, it would wreak havoc on the global financial system. Now, that's just 15 years ago. In the 1980s, we were all having the same debate about U.S. government debt is out of control and it'll never be able to repay it. That's simply not true. I mean, U.S. government debt and U.S. government borrowing as a percent of GDP are both well within normal global ranges. The numbers are only so big because the U.S. is so much bigger than other countries. But the U.S. does not have a serious deficit problem, and it does not have a serious debt problem. Now, about Japan, the second half of the question, could you restate it?
Well, all I was saying is that if the countries are able to migrate beyond the middle income trap, and we hope Japan is now rich and is relatively, obviously, very wealthy and advanced nation, but it is not acting as a motor or as a locomotive for the other developing countries to get off. And hopefully China could do one day, because Vietnam and surrounding nations could benefit from that, but that is also not going to happen probably.
Oh, I think that's really a false characterization of Japan. Remember, Japan has one of the most rapidly aging societies in the world. So if you study the Japanese economy as GDP per person of working age, the economy has not stagnated for 20 or 30 years the way we imagine that it has. Now, of course, in aggregate terms, it has been stagnant because the population is going into decline. It's rapidly aging. But Japan has continued to develop, and Japanese firms have been very important in developing China. The Japanese auto industry decamped en masse to China and was leading the growth of the Chinese auto industry. So Japan is one of the top 5 global investors in China and has been a major force for development in China. So, I don't think it's right to say that Japan is not a motor of the global economy, if you want to use that metaphor. Japan very much is. But, I would also question how meaningful it is to talk about motors of the global economy. I mean, Japan has been moving to more and more post-industrial activities, more of a service economy, more of a very sophisticated manufacturing economy. And as a result, its routine manufacturing is being offshored to places like China and Vietnam, and these days, increasingly, India. We just saw Prime Minister Abe in India for meetings with Prime Minister Modi. And there's going to be a large Japanese investment in rail development in India. They're going to, presumably, that will result in local purchasing in India for the high-speed rail that will be developed in India. So, Japan is very important in Asia for promoting development in the poorer countries of Asia. But Japan is a relatively small country compared to the United States. It's only 1/3 the size, and unlike the United States, is rapidly aging. So, I don't think we should expect Japan, which is poorer, smaller, and older than the U.S., to have the same kind of impact on the global economy that the United States does.
And if we continue on that argument, then, and I don't think this is the right term, but if we use that phrase, then who will, quote unquote, bail out as Japan, quote unquote, invested in China and help them to rise? Who would do that for Brazil or Russia?
Oh, I don't think anyone bails anybody out. The path that we chart in the book is that countries can take responsibility for their own growth. Now, yes, they can use global value chains as one tool to help develop their economies. But, I think the examples of Australia and New Zealand are fantastic examples of countries that have not clawed their way up global value chains. They're rich because they have implemented the sorts of policies we propose in the book. High wages for ordinary people, mass consumption among the whole population, high levels of government redistribution. They implement policies that within their own countries can bring them to high income levels. Clawing your way up a global value chain is one way to develop, but I don't think it's the only way to develop.
I think that's quite okay, yeah. But I think, the basic thing, our argument is technology in a capitalist sense, not in a pre-capitalist sense, means reducing the cost of production by simplifying the products in order to use less labor time for making it. And that's a very specific technical progress, and that means you have to develop the markets of your poor people. There are quite other technical developments which exist also in our society. The other, in ideal form, would be the artist who builds a cathedral. There is a lot of learning in cathedral making, but it will not lead to a lot of technology improvement. Or whether you look at the Mughal policies, they are the same thing. And if you make a very sophisticated car, that will have exactly the same consequences like the palace, provided that there is no democratization of the product. Sometimes the product for the rich leads to technical improvement, but especially when people find out, oh, this technology can be simplified, and then I can make a better product also for the large mass of the people. And that's our argument. You are developing by the large masses of the large market for the people, and our argument is that is not done primarily by the political resistance of the poor people, because the poor people do not know, they have not read us, they will not read us. That is only done if the poor people, for some reasons, get scarce, for example, by agrarian reform, for example, by the fear of the rich. The rich are considering we have to do something for the poor, but otherwise the poor will kill us, etc. I'm not in favor of killing the rich. I'm only saying if the rich people get sufficiently fearful of the poor, then they will do things I said. Otherwise, they will believe in more neoliberal economies and say, it's not necessary.
I think you can see this difference between mass increases in productivity and very narrow ones. If you look at Brazil, Brazil's agricultural sector has incredibly high levels of productivity, is incredibly efficient, but it's achieved that efficiency by getting rid of all the poor farmers and sending them to live in slums and favelas in Rio and Sao Paulo and Salvador. Right? So it's taken a huge portion of Brazil's population and simply warehoused it in slums in order that one small sector can be incredibly productive. Well, that's great for Brazil's agricultural sector, but it's not great for Brazil's economy as a whole. Brazil may have an incredibly efficient agricultural sector, but the rest of Brazil's economy is incredibly inefficient with very low wages, because you can always add more workers instead of investing in increasing productivity. Brazil is the future that the BRICS are tending towards, and I think that if countries like India want to see their potential, they should look to two possible examples of how they could go. They could go the way of an Australia or a Singapore or a New Zealand, or they could go the way of a Brazil. And unfortunately, I think the BRICS are caught in a middle-income trap because politically, their leaders would rather be like Brazil than be like Australia.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Professor Hartmut and Professor Salvatore. Fascinating discussion.